Hey everyone, I'm Adam, and this is Let's Talk Lobster. Today we're discussing the book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor. So the story of a shipwrecked sailor actually has a much longer title, and I'll read that for you here. The story of a shipwrecked sailor who drifted on a life raft for 10 days without food or water, was proclaimed a national hero, kissed by beauty queens, made rich through publicity, and then spurned by the government and forgotten for all time. It's quite a title, and I can see why he went with the abbreviated "The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor" for the cover. Just a little backstory on Marquez. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born in 1927 in Colombia. He's widely considered as one of the most important authors of the 20th century, and he won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. Early in his career, he was a journalist who often criticized the Colombian government. He's best known for his novels, 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera among them. He popularized the use of magical realism, which uses elements of magic. Marquez died of pneumonia in April of 2014. The president of Colombia called him the greatest Colombian who ever lived. So this story was originally published in 1955. It was a 14-part installment that Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote for the newspaper El Espectador. The book itself wasn't published until 1970, so 15 years after the 14-part installment. Here's a brief summary of the book, so if you haven't read it and you're looking to, you might want to stop watching right now. The story takes place in 1955, and it follows Luis Alejandro Velasco. He's a Colombian naval officer. The ship that he's on is sailing from Alabama to his home country of Colombia, and the ship has been weighed down by contraband. While they're on their way back to Colombia, the ship gets hit by a rogue wave, and 8 of those naval officers, they get washed overboard. 7 of them die, and Luis Alejandro Velasco finds a life raft. And most of the story takes place while he's on that life raft. He's dealing with hunger and with thirst, his own thoughts, hallucinations at some point, and we follow him during that journey. Eventually he washes shore. I believe he's there for 8 to 10 days, something like that. And he hits the Colombian shore where he's rescued, and his story comes out. He's given a hero's welcome and a lot of military accolades, and he eventually becomes quite well known, and he begins promoting products and making a living doing that. When the story comes out in 1955, it contradicts the Colombian government's recounting of the story, which had nothing to do with the contraband. So this caused quite a few issues because of the discrepancy in the two stories. In 1955, the story was just a 14-part installment. Originally, the 14-part installment was attributed to Luis Alejandro Velasco himself. And then in 1970, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he wrote the book version. And it was translated into English in 1986. That's the version, obviously, that I was reading. The English version is 106 pages, so it's really not that long. I read it, I believe, in 3 sittings. I think 2 to 4 sittings be normal for most people. I had read 100 Years of Solitude. That was the only Gabriel Garcia Marquez book that I had read. And so I had certain expectations coming into this book. And so I expected magical realism, and I expected very rich and thick sentences where I had to read and reread things to make sure I was understanding things. That really wasn't the case in The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor. It was very straightforward, and it was nonfiction as opposed to the fictional book of 100 Years of Solitude. I did find 100 Years of Solitude to be exceptional, like most everyone else. I finished the book thinking that Marquez was a genius. I started the book quite confused. I couldn't get my character straight, couldn't get the story straight. I was constantly going back and rereading things and checking on individuals' names and their relationships because I was getting confused. But that got easier as time went on, and I ended up just loving that book. So I had certain expectations. This wasn't that type of book. If you're reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez for the first time and you've heard about his style of writing, then you might be disappointed when you read The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor because it doesn't live up to those things that he's famous for, the magical realism especially. This is a nonfiction book, and so as it is a true story, it's not going to have those elements that you might expect from Marquez. It's still a very good book, but I wouldn't read it first if you're trying to dig into Marquez. In all, I really did enjoy the book, and I plan to read more of his books. In fact, I'm reading The Story of a Death Foretold at the moment, and really enjoying that. I'll talk about that book when I've completed it, but for now, that was a reaction to The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any book suggestions, also that would be appreciated. And if you would share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, I would very much appreciate it. Thanks.